So typically when we think about issues related to agricultural pressures on water resources, a lot of those are in the form of nutrients, nutrient contributions, and that just reflects the fact that typically for agricultural systems you have to provide additional nutrients in order to get the crops to grow in a desirable way, that kind of thing. But a lot of those nutrients get carried to the stream as well, and so typically what we're talking about there are nitrogen compounds and phosphorus compounds. And so generally speaking, in freshwater ecosystems, they tend to be more nitrogen limited. Excuse me, they tend to be more phosphorus limited. And so when you get that additional phosphorus into the system, then it ends up causing sort of a shift in how the aquatic community is able to use those nutrients for primary productivity or photosynthesis. So, a lot of times in landscapes, in small streams, you tend to have systems that are dominated by energy that's coming in as a result of things like leaf fall and that kind of thing, and the ecosystems are structured around that. When you get a lot of additional nutrients that are coming in addition to removing canopy cover and that kind of thing, then you get a lot of algae that starts to grow in the streams themselves. And ultimately what that does is it causes a shift in the community structure, the types of insects, aquatic insects that you see there, the types of fish in some cases that you see in those systems. So nutrients definitely play a large role in that. Another thing that tends to play a large role in those systems is that, again, with the overland flow of water, you get sediments that are carried into the systems, into the stream systems, and those sediments can clog the interstices or the spaces that you have between rocks and that kind of thing, and that ends up being a limitation for habitat that's available to a number of different types of organisms. The other thing that happens is that those materials, those sediments, can be suspended in the water column, and because fish are relying on being able to pass water over their gills in order to get oxygen out of the water, if that water has got high concentrations of suspended solids in it, sediment particles, those sediment particles can be very abrasive for the gills of the fish and cause a lot of problems there as well. One of the things that can happen when you get these increased amounts of light, the increased amounts of nutrients, is that you can get eutrophication, which is essentially just an overabundance of primary production in aquatic ecosystems. And sort of the ultimate downside of that can happen when you have so much primary productivity going on, because you've got all these algae and plants and that kind of thing that are photosynthesizing during the day. That's all well and good, because they tend to produce a lot more oxygen than they consume when they're actively photosynthesizing. But the problem comes when the lights go out. Essentially at night, they're not producing that. They're not giving off that additional oxygen anymore. And so what ends up happening is that they start competing with organisms. It could be zooplankton, it could be fish, aquatic insects. It doesn't really matter. Effectively what's happening is that they become competitors for oxygen. And when you get that really high biomass of organisms that are now competing for oxygen, and instead of producing excess oxygen, you can get really big problems with the amount of dissolved oxygen that's present. And once that starts happening, if the dissolved oxygen levels get too low, then you can actually start having organisms that die because they just can't get the levels of oxygen that they need in order to live.
So one of the important things to consider when we talk about runoff from different types of crops during the springtime is that's when we get hit by strong rains. And so when it rains, a lot of these chemicals that are on the surface of these fields can run off from there into the streams. In addition to that, in the state of Indiana, all farms are tile drained, which means that basically If they weren't tile drained, they would be flooded every time it rains. So all the water goes right through into this canal system that then basically diverts directly into streams. For the studies that we do with fish, for instance, it's really critical also to understand that these events, these rain events, these heavy rain events that move chemicals into the water occur right around the time when fish are spawning. And for most small fishes, they hatch very quickly within a few days. So we have embryos and very early life stages of fish being exposed to these chemicals. And we know from many studies that early life stages like those are much more sensitive to the effects of chemicals in general than adults or even juvenile fish.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with a few of those practices. One of the most important are buffer strips. These are planted grasses along the drainage ditches that infiltrate almost all of our ag land. We have these drainage ditches that pull the water, subsoil water, and help dry out and plant. And buffer strip plantings along those waterways can limit the amount of soil that moves, topsoil that moves across the field directly into the waterways, so the grassways will catch that soil. That's one you'll probably see most often in the prairie areas of northern Indiana and Illinois. Other practices include wetland restorations in areas that are subject to erosion, aren't good at agricultural ground anyway, and maybe low-lying ground, converting them back into shallow wetlands can again limit the amount of erosion that takes place in those areas. And there are other conservation practices. I'm not an expert on all, but strips in high-risk agricultural areas, not necessarily wetland areas, but buffer strips and planting can also help there as well. I can say that in intensely cultivated agricultural areas such as Indiana, there is a cost to those conservation practices. The primary cost is the loss of income by not being able to plant that to corn or soybeans or wheat. Some programs offer some payments. The government pays you to put in some of these buffer strips and shallow wetlands so you can recoup some of that money that was lost to not farming it. That's probably the biggest issue for ag farmers. They operate on fairly small margins, so the inputs into farming is very expensive. What they get from the grain in some years can be close to or even below the cost of the inputs. When it's above the cost of the inputs, hopefully that's the case every year, not having that extra acreage and extra income impacts farm families. But understanding that loss of topsoil can occur over generations, if we had more of a long-term vision of protecting our soils for the benefit of future farmers, I think that's something we should be really looking at. Some farmers just philosophically don't want to accept government assistance or payments, and that prevents them from implementing these practices. They have to do it on their own money, and those are the real limitations to why we don't have more of those practices. My preference is to have a lot of wildlife around and different varieties of wildlife, and that was really the driving force for me implementing some of these grasslands and buffer strips. Songbirds and game birds and game mammals really benefit, and that was my driving force. My secondary driving force is protection of the soils in those sensitive areas. And so the three practices I've used are the buffer strips along a large drainage ditch, recreation of a shallow wetland, and then restoration of some prairie grass areas that they're not in a program, so those were done on my own money, and again it was just to increase the wildlife in small areas amidst the large agricultural areas. I think education about the long-term issues that erosion and wind erosion create will be helpful for them to understand that their future family members who will be farming may benefit from conservation practices that are put in place now. Could be generations away. I think the younger generation is more receptive to those kinds of educational programs and information. And our hope is that, as high school, college students, and even younger students see this message going into the future, that they will respect the diversity of wildlife. They'll respect the attempts to save topsoil, and can, when they become agriculturalists or anyone who may be able to help in an extension role, for example, we may see some improvements in the future.